Namaste, Jai Shri Ram. Hope all of you are doing good. In the previous video, we had mentioned on how caste discrimination did not exist in ancient Bharat. In fact, the corruption of the ancient Varnashram Dharma started somewhere in the 4th century AD. But before that, I would like to make one clarification. In the previous video, I had mentioned that Megasthenes had come to Bharat in the 4th century during the reign of Chandragupta Maurya. It was a mistake. I wanted to say 4th century BC. This kind of mistake is pretty dangerous because 4th century BC, the time that Megasthenes came to Bharat, to the time that caste discrimination was first recorded during the time of Fa Xian in 4th century AD, is already a span of 800 years, which is a very crucial period, a great span of time. But while we are on Megasthenes, I would also like to highlight the fact that even though Chandragupta Maurya did not belong to what would be considered as a high caste, he was selected and groomed by the great Chanakya, who was a Brahmin. Yes, the same Chanakya who is considered as one of the greatest scholars and thinkers, the author of Chanakya Niti and Arthashastra. And in the last video, I didn't highlight the fact that Fa Xian's visit to Bharat in the 4th century AD was in the reign of the Gupta Empire, who were devout Hindus. While it's a different subject, but one can see the beautiful coexistence that was there between followers of the Vedic, Buddhist, and Jain traditions. The Buddhist University of Nalanda, which is considered as one of the world's greatest universities of the ancient world, which Fa Xian visited and also studied in, was built by the Hindu Gupta kings. But coming back to our subject, we had discussed on how there was such a growth in the number of today's low castes, scheduled castes, and tribes that form a big number of our population today. One of the greatest books on this subject is by the historian K.S. Lal in his book, who wrote the book Growth of Scheduled Castes and Tribes in Medieval India. I'm pretty sure that future generations would consider him to be the greatest historians to ever have appeared. So he writes on the fact that many of the tribes of today claim a Rajput or a Suryavansh legacy, Suryavansh heritage. K.S. Lal writes that many of these people, many of their ancestors fought with the Muslims, but when they got defeated, they retreated into the forests or in the villages. Over a period of time, they began to form a separate community and then got the status of today's scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. But according to K.S. Lal, their origins were Kshatriya and Rajput in their origin. Something which today's Marxist scholars scoff, but if one reads this book, one would be very convinced of K.S. Lal's arguments, which definitely are based on empirical evidences. So we can see that the problem is that another way that besides the point that many of the scheduled caste and tribes ancestors fought with the Muslims, another way that the growth of another way that the growth of scheduled castes took place, K.S. Lal highlights in his books, is because of the fact that there was a growing orthodoxy towards anyone who associated with Muslims. So, for example, Hindus who served in the kitchens of the sultanates or the Mughals, or anyone who indulged in any profession connected with the meat industry or leather industry, or anyone who had any kind of dealings or business with the Muslims, they would be declared, their dharam would be declared as brushed, and in after some time they would be counted as people who were outcast from the hierarchy or the system. But the most important point over here is that while rigidity and discrimination was becoming a reality during the Muslim period, the growing discrimination was becoming a reality during the Muslim period, it was not as if it put an end to people from lower castes progressing to higher caste and so on. This was pretty common. It was still common among many of the royal dynasties who came from Shudra or who would be considered as lower caste today, to move upwards to becoming Kshatriyas. A case in example are the great Reddy kings who appeared in the 14th century in the south. They were what would be considered as low caste today, but moved up to Kshatriyas and great rulers of the time. Similarly, Harihara and Bukka wouldn't qualify as someone belonging to upper caste today. They were forcibly converted to Islam, but under the guidance of the great Brahmin saint Vidyaranya, who was connected to the Shringeri Mutt, they were crowned as Kshatriyas and the rulers of the great Vijayanagar Empire, an empire which was even a great inspiration to a person no less than Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. And despite discrimination, as we mentioned, growing in the period, the Bhakti school of thought, which became very powerful, be it the Alvars and Nayanars in Tamil Nadu, or Ramanuj, Madhavacharya, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and Vallabhacharya, all these Bhakti movements broke through all kinds of caste barriers. It transcended all kinds of differences that existed in society. That's the reason why the advent of the British rule is the real time when caste hierarchy started to get formulated and discrimination became more rigid. In this, I would like to quote author Nandita Krishna in her article "A Brief History of Caste in India and the British Rule," where she quotes, and I quote over here, the anthropologist Susan Bailey of Cambridge University, who says, "Until well into the colonial period, much of the subcontinent was still populated by people for whom the formal distinctions of caste were only of limited importance, even in parts of the so-called Hindu heartland. The institutions and beliefs which are now often described as elements of the traditional caste system were only just taking shape as recently as the early 18th century. It is therefore the British rule and their commencing reservations and our governments continuing it in independent India, and not just continuing it but also increasing it and extending it to an extent that has become a political tool with every community claiming that they were being oppressed and deserved reservation. Those who have been landholders or members of prominent communities for quite some time also are seeking a backward status if they haven't yet got one. Whereas many of the Brahmin communities who are among the poorest in states like Tamil Nadu feel completely hopeless. A lot of such claims have turned into fiction and fantasy and less of facts, with those descendants or whose ancestors were genuinely discriminated questioning the process. So we will leave it to that. But yes, we can say that while caste discrimination did not start with the foreign rulers, probably commenced somewhere from the 4th century, but just commenced, it did worsen with the Muslim and then especially the Christian period, the British period. But there were no doubts that over a period of time, discrimination of scheduled castes that was pretty bad 50, 100, 200 years back has genuinely decreased, and that's a great sign. But before I conclude this video, I would like to point out over here that there are some who say that caste discrimination is so entrenched in our country that it should be imperative upon the governments to keep running temples, otherwise scheduled castes and lower castes may not be able to enter them. This was a favorite theme for our leftists and also those of the Nehruvian secularist stream. But many of our Hindutva people have also picked up on these themes by giving some stray comments made by a well-known Shankaracharya who's quite reputed for making such kind of outlandish claims and using that as a pretext to say that, well, if such people held sway, then many temples may not allow people from the so-called lower caste to come in, forgetting that this Shankaracharya does not even have that much command over the area that he's based in. Not many people even follow him over there. So what to speak about the rest of the country? The fact remains that temples, since quite some time now, have been open to all members of the Hindu community. So that's no excuse. But even let's presume that the government or anybody else has this kind of doubt, then it should be laid down when the governments give over the control to Hindu institutions and private trusts. They should emphasize this point that the temples cannot prohibit entry to any Hindu whatsoever. And while the temples can be run according to the rituals and the traditions of the various of the sampradaya the temple is from, there cannot be any kind of rule that prohibits entry to any Hindu man or woman. That can be something which can be emphasized very clearly. But obviously, the fact remains that this is just an excuse and nothing else. Another excuse that people make is that if the temples are given to Hindu institutions, they may prohibit people who are not born in Brahmin families to become priests. That's a good point. Till you come to the actual fact that most of the temples today, especially in the south and west of the country, are being run by the governments. How many of them actually allow non-Brahmins to become priests? That's a good question, and one would find that they are very few. In fact, if anything, the credit should go to Vishwa Hindu Parishad and Arya Samaj for throwing open their temples to every single person can become a priest. And VHP has been doing a remarkable job, especially in Tamil Nadu, where they have trained many Dalits as priests. So the fact remains, and also Arya Samaj, who has been training women to become priests. And by the way, not many people have actually objected to that. It's another point that it's not come into the mainstream in a big way possible, but many people who have actually taken the services of these women priests, or even those priests who were Dalits by birth, have only mentioned how great these people were and how lucky they were to engage in their services. In that respect, one also knows that in Patna, there's a famous temple of Mahavir, where there's a famous Dalit priest who is respected and venerated throughout the community. So the point over here is that these are only excuses, because VHP and Arya Samaj have shown that there is absolutely no mention in the Vedas or anywhere in the scriptures which say that only those who are born as Brahmins should become the priests. Uh, the fact remains that the governments have no business running temples, because when the temples are the people putting money in temples are doing that for the temple, whereas governments running them are misusing them for secular purposes, and even in some cases misusing them to finance the projects of other religious communities, religious minorities, and so on, which is absolutely unfair. So with this, I would like to conclude the video, and I would like to once again emphasize that caste discrimination did not exist in ancient Bharat, and the present system where only people who are born in a certain community have to stay in that caste for life is definitely a corruption of the ancient Varnashram Dharma, and we hope that in due course this will be corrected. Namaste, Jai Shri Ram, Jai Shri Krishna.